I had just pulled into my driveway, exhausted from a long day at work, when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of fast, angry footsteps approaching. Before I even had the chance to step out of my car, an all too familiar shrill voice cut through the evening air. "You can't park there!" I turned my head, already feeling the headache creeping in. And there she was, Karen, the self-proclaimed queen of the neighborhood, standing at the edge of my driveway with her arms crossed so tightly it looked like she was trying to squeeze the life out of herself. I blinked at her, confused. "What?" Karen huffed, flipping her over-processed blonde hair with the dramatic energy of a soap opera villain. "This is a violation of HOA regulations. You're blocking a shared roadway," she screeched, jabbing a perfectly manicured finger in my direction. I frowned, glancing around. My driveway. My property. My car. "No shared roadway, no problem." "Karen, this is my driveway," I said, trying to keep my voice level. "I live here." Her eyes narrowed, her lips pursing like she had just bitten into the sourest lemon imaginable. "That doesn't matter. Driveways are considered part of the aesthetic of the community, and you're ruining it by parking like that." I stared at her, waiting for the punchline. But Karen wasn't joking. She was standing there, genuinely outraged, over the fact that I had parked at a slight angle, still fully within my property line, mind you, because I had groceries to unload. I sighed, rubbing a hand over my face. "Karen, go inside," I muttered, grabbing the first bag of groceries. That should have been the end of it. But no. This was Karen. Nothing was ever simple with Karen. "I'm calling the police," she snapped, pulling out her phone with a dramatic flourish. "You can't just do whatever you want in this neighborhood. There are rules." At first, I thought she was bluffing. I mean, what kind of person calls 911 over a parked car in someone's own driveway? But before I could even process how ridiculous the situation was, I heard her talking, actually talking, to a 911 dispatcher. "Yes, there's a suspicious vehicle blocking a driveway," she said, her voice dripping with self-importance. My jaw nearly hit the pavement. "He's refusing to move," she added, casting me a triumphant glare. "I think he might be dangerous." My brain short-circuited. Dangerous? Was she out of her mind? I opened my mouth to argue, but what was I even supposed to say? "Excuse me, officer, I'm just a man trying to bring in my damn groceries." I stood there, bag of frozen peas in one hand, watching as she continued her Oscar-worthy performance. Yes, please hurry," she whined, pacing in circles like a rabid chihuahua. "I don't feel safe." My left eye twitched. I had dealt with Karen's nonsense before, complaints about my lawn being half an inch too tall, passive-aggressive notes about my trash cans being left out for too long, but this was next-level insanity. Less than 10 minutes later, the flashing lights of a patrol car lit up the street. The sight of them seemed to inflate Karen with the kind of smug satisfaction usually reserved for cartoon villains. She marched up to the officers like she was welcoming long-lost friends. "Oh, thank goodness you're here. This man," she spun dramatically, pointing at me like I was some kind of hardened criminal, "has been illegally blocking the driveway and refusing to leave." One of the officers, a tired-looking guy who had clearly seen enough nonsense for one lifetime, turned to me. "Sir, do you live here?" I exhaled, nodding. "Yeah. This is my house. That's my car. In my driveway." The officer's eyes flickered between me and Karen. "So, you're parked in your own driveway?" "Yes," I said slowly, trying to keep my patience in check. The second officer, a younger guy who looked like he was barely holding back laughter, cleared his throat. "Ma'am," he said, addressing Karen, "is there a reason you called 911 for this?" Karen gasped as if she had been personally attacked. "Of course there is. He's breaking HOA regulations. Look at how he's parked." She gestured wildly like she was presenting Exhibit A in a high-stakes courtroom drama. The older cop let out a slow, exhausted breath. "Ma'am, HOA rules are not enforceable by police. This is private property." Karen's face turned an alarming shade of red. But "But it's obstructing the neighborhood's aesthetic appeal," she shrieked. The younger officer snorted before quickly covering it with a fake cough. "Sir," he said, turning to me, "you're good to go. Sorry for the inconvenience." I shrugged, already knowing that arguing with Karen was like trying to teach a goldfish algebra. "No problem, officer." Karen, however, was not ready to accept defeat. "You're just going to let him get away with this?" she demanded, stomping her foot like an overgrown toddler. The older officer's patience finally snapped. "Ma'am, this is not a police matter. If you call 911 for non-emergencies again, you could be charged with misuse of emergency services." The color drained from Karen's face. But have a good night, ma'am," the officer said firmly before turning on his heel and heading back to the patrol car. I waved as they drove away, not even bothering to hide my grin. Karen stood there, fuming, her jaw clenched so tight I thought her teeth might crack. "You'll regret this," she hissed before storming off toward her house. I rolled my eyes. Classic Karen. I figured that would be the end of it, a ridiculous story to tell my friends later. But the next morning, when I stepped outside to grab the mail, my stomach dropped. Sitting on top of my usual stack of bills and advertisements was a crisp white envelope. HOA letterhead. I tore it open and scanned the contents, my blood pressure spiking with every word. Violation. Obstructing a shared roadway. Fine. $500. I read it again, certain I must have misinterpreted something. But no, there it was, in bold, patronizing letters. I glanced up, my gaze immediately locking onto Karen's house. And sure enough, there she was, standing on her porch with the smuggest, most insufferable grin I had ever seen. She waved, the kind of wave that said, "Checkmate." My hands tightened around the letter. Oh, it was on. I stormed back into my house, still clutching the ridiculous HOA letter in my hand. A $500 fine for parking in my own driveway? It had to be a joke. But one look at Karen's smug expression across the street told me otherwise. This wasn't over. Not even close. I needed answers, and I needed them now. Without wasting another second, I grabbed my keys and drove straight to the HOA office, which was conveniently located in the community center. As I pushed open the door, I was greeted by the sterile, overly perfumed air and the distant hum of a coffee machine. The receptionist barely looked up as I approached, too engrossed in her phone to care. "I need to speak to whoever handles HOA fines," I said, barely keeping my frustration in check. She sighed, chewing her gum loudly as she lazily gestured toward an office door at the end of the hall. I walked over and knocked, already mentally preparing my argument. The door swung open, and there she was, Karen, sitting behind a desk like some kind of evil overlord, a nameplate reading, HOA Vice President, perched smugly in front of her. My stomach sank. Of course, Karen had wormed her way into a position of power. This explained everything. She leaned back in her chair, a slow, satisfied grin creeping onto her face. Well. If it isn't the driveway obstructionist himself," she said, lacing her fingers together. "Here to pay your fine?" I took a deep breath, shoving the letter onto her desk. "This is ridiculous, and you know it. I was parked in my own driveway." She feigned an exaggerated gasp. "Oh dear, I'm afraid the rules are the rules. Section 12. Subsection B of the HOA parking regulations clearly states that any vehicle obstructing the flow of traffic is subject to penalties." I narrowed my eyes. "My driveway isn't a traffic flow. It's private property," she smirked, tapping a perfectly manicured nail against the desk. "Well, actually, driveways are considered part of the shared visual harmony of the neighborhood. And yours? Disruptive?" I clenched my jaw, fighting the urge to grab the nearest stapler and launch it across the room. "So let me get this straight. You're saying that me parking on my own property is a violation because it doesn't look good to you?" She shrugged. "It's not personal. Just business." I stared at her in disbelief. She was actually enjoying this. That's when I knew she wasn't going to budge. If I wanted to beat her at her own game, I had to think bigger. I had to find a way to hit her where it hurt. Without another word, I turned on my heel and walked out. I could hear her smug chuckle following me out the door. The moment I got home, I pulled up the HOA's bylaws, determined to find a loophole. And sure enough, there it was. Buried deep in the fine print was a clause that stated the HOA could only issue fines for parking violations on shared community property, not private driveways. My heart raced with excitement. I had her, but I needed more. If I was going to take Karen down, I needed leverage. And as fate would have it, leverage came knocking sooner than I expected. Later that evening, I was enjoying a beer on my porch, thinking through my next move, when I heard the rumble of a heavy engine. I glanced up just in time to see a tow truck creeping down the street. My stomach twisted with unease. Something wasn't right. The truck slowed to a stop right in front of my house, and that's when I saw him. The tow truck driver stepping out, clipboard in hand, heading straight for my car. I was on my feet in seconds, rushing down my porch step. Whoa, whoa, whoa. What do you think you're doing? The driver barely spared me a glance. Vehicle removal. HOA violation, he said flatly, moving toward my car with practiced ease. Wait a second, you can't tow from private property, I snapped, blocking his path. He sighed, pulling out a work order. Says here HOA authorized it. My blood boiled. Karen. This was her doing. She had escalated things yet again, now trying to have my car taken away. I yanked out my phone, already dialing the non-emergency police line. You're not touching my car, I said firmly as I waited for the call to connect. The driver hesitated, clearly not in the mood for a fight, but also not eager to walk away from a paying job. Minutes later, a patrol car rolled up, and I wasted no time explaining the situation. The officer, a grizzled veteran who had clearly seen it all, turned to the tow truck driver. You got a removal order for a vehicle on public property? The driver nodded. Yeah, HOA called it in. The officer's expression hardened. This is private property. That order doesn't mean a damn thing here. The tow truck driver sighed, clearly regretting ever getting involved, and with a defeated nod, he climbed back into his truck and drove off. Karen, who had been watching from her front porch like a vulture, came storming over, face red with anger. You had no right to interfere, she shrieked, pointing an accusing finger at me. The officer turned to her, unimpressed. Ma'am, if you attempt to have a vehicle towed from private property again, you could be charged with trespassing and attempted theft. Karen's mouth snapped shut so fast I was surprised she didn't bite her tongue. She looked back and forth between me and the officer, clearly scrambling for a way to regain control. But this time, she had lost. The officer gave me a nod before heading back to his car, leaving Karen seething. You think you've won? She hissed, voice low and furious. This isn't over. I smirked, crossing my arms. Oh, I know it's not. But it's going to be. With that, I turned and walked back into my house, feeling the first taste of victory settle in my chest. But I wasn't done yet. I had the bylaw loophole in my back pocket, but I needed a way to really hit back. Then, an idea struck me. The HOA wasn't just a dictatorship run by Karen. It was a board. A board that could be voted out. If I could rally enough homeowners who were just as fed up with her nonsense, I could turn the tables completely. Karen had played her game long enough. Now it was my turn. I barely slept that night, fueled by equal parts frustration and determination. Karen had spent years terrorizing the neighborhood, but this time she had gone too far. First, she called the cops on me for parking in my own driveway. Then she tried to fine me $500, and when that didn't work, she had my car nearly towed from my own property. It was clear that as long as she had power in the HOA, she would keep making my life, and probably everyone else's, a living nightmare. But she had made one crucial mistake. She thought I would just roll over and take it. What she didn't realize was that I was done playing defense. It was time to go on the offensive. The next morning, I started my plan by talking to my neighbors. It wasn't hard to find people who hated Karen. Within minutes of mentioning her name, my next-door neighbor, an older man named Mr. Thompson, launched into a rant about how she had fined him $200 for using the wrong shade of blue on his mailbox. Down the street, a couple told me how she had cited them for having their holiday decorations up 2 days past the HOA's approved window. Every house I visited had a story, each more ridiculous than the last. People had been quietly fuming for years, too afraid of the hassle to fight back. But now that someone was standing up to her, they were more than happy to get involved. It didn't take long to find the key to taking her down. The HOA had a rule buried deep in the bylaws that stated if enough homeowners signed a petition, a special election could be held to recall board members. Karen had bulldozed her way into a position of power, but she could be voted out just as easily. I spent the entire day gathering signatures. Some people didn't even let me finish my sentence before grabbing the clipboard and signing with the enthusiasm of someone signing a winning lottery ticket. By the time the sun had set, I had more than enough names to force a recall vote. I walked into the HOA office the next morning with the petition in hand, ready to deliver the final blow. Karen was at her desk, as usual, sipping on what I could only assume was overpriced, non-fat, gluten-free nonsense in a coffee cup. She looked up and smirked as I approached. "Back again? Here to finally pay your fine?" she asked, leaning back in her chair. I dropped the thick stack of signatures on her desk. Her smirk faltered as she reached for the papers, flipping through them with increasing panic. "What is this?" she demanded, eyes darting over the names. "That," I said, crossing my arms, "is a recall petition. You see, Karen, the people in this neighborhood are tired of your nonsense, and according to HOA bylaws, when enough homeowners sign a petition, a special election has to be held to vote on removing the board member in question. Congratulations, that board member is you." For the first time since this whole ordeal started, Karen was speechless. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Then, like a switch had been flipped, she went straight into denial mode. "This isn't valid," she snapped, flipping through the pages. "You probably forged these names. This won't hold up." I shrugged. "Go ahead and verify them. But every single name on that list belongs to a real homeowner in this neighborhood. And all of them want you gone." She shot up from her chair, her face a deep shade of red. "This is harassment. You can't do this to me." I smiled. "Actually, I can. And I did." The next week was pure chaos. Karen fought the recall with everything she had, but the HOA bylaws were clear. The signatures were verified, the election was scheduled, and the countdown to her downfall had officially begun. She tried everything, sending out mass emails claiming I was trying to destroy the neighborhood, calling emergency HOA meetings where she painted herself as a victim of an unfair smear campaign, even going door to door herself to convince people to change their vote. But the damage was done. People had seen the way she operated, and no amount of last-minute groveling was going to save her. Election day arrived faster than I expected, and the community center was packed with homeowners eager to cast their vote. I stood near the back, watching as people filed in, the tension in the air almost electric. Karen, dressed in her usual smug superiority, stood near the voting booths, trying one last time to sway opinions. But the whispers around the room told me all I needed to know. People weren't buying it. An hour later, the results were announced. Karen had lost. Badly. She didn't just lose by a small margin, she was absolutely demolished. The look on her face as the final vote count was read was priceless. Her hands clenched into fists, her whole body shaking with barely contained rage. "This isn't fair," she hissed under her breath. "This is rigged." The HOA president, a man who had always seemed a little afraid of Karen but clearly wasn't anymore, sighed. "Karen, you've been voted out. It's over." Karen opened her mouth to argue, but the entire room erupted into cheers and applause. For the first time, the neighborhood was united in something. And that something was celebrating Karen's removal. As I walked out of the community center, A weight I didn't even realize I had been carrying lifted off my shoulders. It was finally over. No more petty fines, no more ridiculous power trip. The neighborhood could finally breathe again. Karen, however, didn't take the loss well. She stormed out moments later, shoving past people with enough force to knock over a few folding chairs. She stomped right up to me, jabbing a finger in my chest. "You think you've won?" she spat, her voice shaking with fury. "You think this is over?" I grinned. "Oh, I don't think, Karen. I know." Her nostrils flared, her hands shaking at her sides. And then, without another word, she turned and stormed off toward her house, slamming the door behind her with enough force to rattle the windows. The best part came a few days later. With Karen gone, the new HOA board wasted no time reversing some of her worst policies, including the ridiculous fine she had tried to stick me with. Not only was the charge dropped, but they also sent me a refund for the trouble she caused. I didn't need the money, but I had to admit, the irony of it was delicious. That evening, I parked my car diagonally in my driveway just for the fun of it. Karen, still fuming from her downfall, peeked through her curtains, probably debating whether she could still call someone to complain. But this time, she had no power. No influence. Nothing. As I sat back on my porch, watching the sunset with a cold drink in hand, I let out a satisfied sigh. I had won. The HOA was back in the hands of reasonable people, Karen had been dethroned, and best of all, I could finally park in my own driveway without fear of a police raid. It had been a long battle, but in the end, justice had prevailed. And if Karen ever tried anything again, well, I was more than ready for round two.